Chapter 23, Ambassadress of the Nation. As 1300 drew toward its close, the king, as well as the queen, pushed forward works of peace. He was busy superintending the actual purchase of the university properties. He was building churches in Vilnius, extending Valval Castle, and making plans to girdle the hill with entirely new fortifications. And he was especially occupied outside the capital. He encouraged the growth of towns lying to the east of Krakow, and further developed the lucrative salt mines of Wieliczka and Bochnia, and the important trade of the city, Lvov. Here was an itinerant ruler, doing business on the spot as he visited one after another of his cities, or put up at successive royal castles or monasteries. Jadwiga realized now how much her mother had been alone. Yet, after all, not alone, for she had had her children. She, like the king, had much to do abroad, though usually within a narrower radius. One or another of her gilded carriages, its half-dozen horses glistening after their brushing, seemed every few days to be clattering across the courtyard and pulling up at the castle steps. She did not merely endow monasteries and convents and hospitals, but personally followed their progress. She directed the care of the sick and the poor. A Krakow stonemason, whom she one day stopped to praise as he worked, reverently modeled her foot in stone. This sculptured plaque, set in the wall of the Carmelite monastery, is today, for Krakowians, a sacred reminder of their debt to their Christian queen. She frequently visited nearby abbeys and convents to examine their treasure of books before ordering her own. She could not often enough turn the pages of the gorgeous liturgical manuscripts of the Cistercians in Mogila village near the capital, or other famous leaves belonging to the Benedictine brothers at Tyniec. A certain missal with a calendar there, travelers told her, had no equal in any country. One of her own secretaries, the priest Nicholas Tromba, was a painter of parts, and when he was not overwhelmed with letters to be sent and answered, and with the writing of documents to which with twisted red and green cords he attached the queen's large wax seal, he illustrated for her exquisite little books of hours, copies of sermons, botanies, and other scientific works. She and Jogaila were planning together in memory of his conversion, an elaborate book for one of the new churches in Vilnius. It was to have several parts, one to present in glowing words and illuminated picture the coming of the Lord, another the dedication of the church, and a third the gospel of Nicodemus. Unfortunately, still threatening to undo this work of civilization loomed the machinations of the order and the reckless adventuring of Vytautas, ironical checkmating, both that of the order, which had been itself the greatest civilizing agency along the Baltic, and that of Vytautas, whose enterprises sprang at least partly from his dream of carrying the blessings of the West to the East. Yet despite countercurrents, wherever one traveled on the great plains of the Vistula, he heard the noise of hammer and chisel, or encountered a bold trade caravan. A manifold activity testified to the momentum of the forces building the new state. In France, wrecked by the 100 Years' War; in Hungary, disintegrating under Sigismund; in Bohemia, weary of the irregularities of Wenceslaus; in Germany, struggling toward unity; in Muscovy, where Duke Vasily, in dread of a Tatar conquest, had ordered from Vladimir to Moscow the miracle-working icon. In every court in Europe, men watched with astonishment and admiration and envy the progress of the empire on the western frontier. Could they have looked further, they would have seen in this progress the dawn of Poland's golden age. Yet, constantly dangers had to be dealt with. The Duke of Opeln, who needed money, saw in the order's ambition to possess the Dobrzen lands his opportunity to rehabilitate himself. So, maintaining that he held this territory independently, and not as a loyal vassal from the crown, he perilously involved himself with the knights. A strong party, including the king, greatly aroused by the order's hold on this northern province, favored war. Some urged it, but Jadwiga still worked unwearyingly to prevent it. So far, she had exhibited an extraordinary skill in calming the ever-reborn dispute, winning again and again a peace which she herself feared was but a truce. In this Dobrzyn conflict, she advocated the method of peaceful negotiation with the same vigor, the confidence which she had shown in a different way, when she rode at the head of an army to rescue Red Ruthenia, and later, when she made the daring attempt to claim the Arpad inheritance after her sister's death. Some of those who witnessed that earlier resoluteness were puzzled by her pacific attitude toward the order, but others understood that this stand revealed a yet finer quality of courage. It was no easy position to take. She took it because she foresaw the suffering that must desolate her land once the orders and Poland's armies were in battle. People blessed her for having saved them from this war thus far. Moreover, she still saw on the breast of the knights the cross of Christ, and believed, despite their iniquities, that beneath it must remain something of their earlier spirit. That spirit which had called her father to aid them might even now be moved to see justice. Her influence was so strong that she carried both the king and the nobles with her, and so complete was their confidence in her that they asked her to go in April 1397 as the ambassadress of the whole nation, to treat directly with the Grand Master for the restoration of the occupied Polish lands. Preliminary interchanges began immediately. Envoys hurried between Krakow and Marienburg. The meeting place was agreed upon, one of the order's fortified castles that stood near the border of the disputed province. Passports were exchanged. Grand Master Conrad von Jungingens to Queen Jadwiga and her company, hers to the master and his knights. Those to accompany the queen were chosen. First among her political advisers were Sędziwoj of Zubin, governor of Kalisz, and Jasko of Tencin, Châtelain of Voynix, and leading those from her court were Peter Ripska, its head, her chamberlain, Jakuz of Botocino, and her master of the table, Jasko of Szczekociny. Then followed an impressive retinue of prelates and magnates. No effort was spared to make the embassy, through its official importance and the splendor of its appearance, represent the power of Poland. The journey would be, as usual, not merely a journey, but for the queen, work all along the route. She must conduct a moving court. Whenever she approached a town, officials in their robes of office and the guilds with their banners would welcome her at its gates, and at the cathedral portal the clergy in ceremonial dress would be waiting to lead her, to music, inside. Every great convent along the route was counting on having the Holy Queen and benefactress under its roof for at least one night, while monasteries competed with cities for that honor. However, during most of the halts, a royal castle or hunting lodge would be headquarters. Krakow had lived through so many thrilling moments since the little girl from Buda arrived, that one might have expected it to be less enthusiastically responsive to new ones than it was. There was no limit to its interest in anything that touched the most beloved queen, accustomed, as far back as their memories reached, to seeing, on an alarm from the north, lines of steel-clad troops gallop out through the gate. The people were profoundly stirred, as with prayer and chanting. They watched the queen and her escort depart on this strange mission. She passed the first night at the convent of our Lord's tomb in Mieczał. By April 26th, the company were in Kalisz, where they were guests of the city. No pressure of official duties ever completely took Jadwiga's thoughts from those things, which to her were of deepest importance, and here she turned aside to reward her faithful old cook, Dominicus, with the gift of a measure of land in the village of Skotniki. She spent May 8th, the day of Poland's patron saint, Stanislas, formally celebrated across the land, in Poznan. There, after joining in the religious and civil ceremonies, she remained to assist at the sessions of the Royal Court of Justice, which were attended by high officials from all parts of the province, gathered to welcome her. At Gniezno, capital of the archbishopric, she was the guest of the archbishop. In the cathedral, where were buried the relics of the martyr, Saint Adalbert, worshipped by the entire Polish people, a magnificent mass was celebrated. Then, after several days, which rivaled preceding ones in commemorative spectacle, the procession began the last stage of its journey. Another stop at Lond, where the queen made a donation to the Cistercian convent and at the end of over a month and a half's traveling, they had their first glimpse of the towers of the fortress castle at Inoroklavyu, in which success or failure awaited them. This was but one of the many strongholds that lifted grimly, impressively, from the wide-flung territories of the extraordinary theocracy. Each of its 20 districts was under a land council of the Grand Master. Before they reached the castle, the Poles were welcomed by a company of knights, wearing white capes and helmets topped with the waving iridescence of peacock feathers and winged spurs. Waiting at the forbidding gateway were Grand Master Conrad, members of his council, the marshal, hospitaller, treasurer, keeper of the wardrobe, and other high officers. They were broad-shouldered, bearded, vigorous men, and wore two white capes over their robes and breastplates again emblazoned with the cross. Others were in less brilliant costumes. Monks added their note of dark simplicity to the scene. Jadwiga's retinue had wished the conference might have been held at the great headquarters, Marienburg, with reports of which the world rang, but they soon saw that this smaller seat had its own beauty of inner court and Gothic hall, and outlying buildings. Upon everything it possessed, the order set the seal of splendor, despite the fact that groups in Europe were attempting to dethrone the Church, and although the 100 Years' War and Hussite and other disaffections had already diminished contributions to the White Capes, they were still, in appearance, at the zenith of power. In their progress toward the control of a territory embracing, as it now did under Conrad, thousands of hamlets and villages, many fortified castles, and over 100 fortified cities, these German builders had demonstrated the power of pageantry and the influence of majestic buildings. After the Queen and her suite had visited the chapel and refreshed themselves in quarters assigned them, they were escorted to the reception hall. Its ceiling held many delicate vaulting ribs sprung from a series of clustered piers running along the middle of the room. In the arched spaces between the corbels, frescoes represented the coronation and other scenes from the life of the Holy Virgin, for whom the order's chief castle, Marienburg, was named. The stained glass windows presented portrait figures of former Grand Masters. Painted wooden cabinets stood against the walls, and heavy oaken benches and iron-bound chests and tables at the end of the room opposite the Grand Master's dais, which had a strip of red velvet Brussels carpet before it. Huge logs burned in the open fireplaces, and, even though this was the 10th of June, added warmth from the central heating plant below rose through the perforated brass plates set in the marble floor. Underneath a high-built musician's balcony ran a row of animal skulls and horns, and at various points hung other trophies of the chase. The quick-eyed Poles, as they moved about, missed none of these details. But the thought uppermost in their minds as the scene unrolled was that despite the dynamic appearance, the assurance of Master Conrad and his German soldiers, the impression made by their queen transcended all else. How regal she was in her gold crown with its circling lilies of France, and her ermine-lined crimson velvet mantle. Her severe white robe was ornamented only by the Polish eagle embroidered in white on her breast, and was held above the hips by a broad gold girdle. In her eyes shone a burning purpose, yet with complete realization of the difficulties before her, she controlled her impatience to drive at once to the point. A banquet followed the reception, during which an orchestra played in the overhanging balcony. Delicacies from almost every country in Europe were served, while horn beakers were often refilled with old Rhine wine mixed with eggs and milk. The visitors were amused with wrestling and fencing matches, and entertained by singing chroniclers of the order. On the following day, there would be a tournament in which hosts and guests were to compete. The diplomatic conversations began the morning after the arrival, prefaced pleasantly by reminiscences of the visits of the Queen's father, Louis, Rex Christianissimus, of his sojourns before he started for, and after he returned from the crusade against the Lithuanian pagans. Conrad and his soldiers were genuinely moved by this dramatic sequence. Louis's daughter within their gates. Had she but come on their business. For while they honored and reverenced her both for her father's sake and for her own long, patient intervention on their behalf. They had no thought of yielding, except in appearance, to her demand. They would never part with occupied Dobrzen territory. They had the Holy Roman Emperor's support in their possession of it, or with any other land, except at the point of the sword. Still arrogantly confident, they saw no sword breaking their own. At the end of several days' argument, Conrad offered to remind Opeln that he held his lands as a vassal of Poland. Further, he agreed to restore certain portions of the Dobrzen if Poland would pay the order 40,000 florins, loaned, he held, when the land was taken as security. That was the best he could do. All present knew that this proposition was but veiled refusal. Jadwiga had fought with extraordinary energy and diplomatic skill. Realizing that this was probably her last important opportunity in that battle, which she had believed for so long she might eventually win, she returned again and again to the field after it appeared lost. At the end, lifting her hand as she faced Conrad, in a voice in which the note of prophecy mingled with bitterness and sadness, she cried, "So long as I live, the crown will endure your iniquities. But after my death, the chastisement of heaven will fall upon you, and then inevitable war will consummate your ruin." She turned back heavy-heartedly toward Krakow, yet she still refused to believe that the door had completely shut. She would continue her struggle, however hopeless it might seem, to shield her people from war. Despite the failure of her mission, after her return, according to custom, she sent gifts to the Grand Master in recognition of his hospitality, among them 3 unusually fine mushrooms. Later dates reveal how busy the Queen kept Trumba and other secretaries during the remainder of this year and the succeeding one. She tried to gain her objective first by one path, then by another, as she persistently repeated her demand. As 1398 advanced, no messenger rode through Wawel Gate more frequently than the knight wearing the tuft of peacock plumes on his helmet, and carrying in his leather saddlebag a parchment to which was attached Conrad's heavy wax seal. On the royal desk, the communications in only a single packet bore the dates: March 30th, April 15th, May, June, July 2nd, August 4th. When the Grand Master was not writing about the Dobrzen land controversy, he was asking for a lowering of Krakow's customs duties, or complaining against some obstructionist act of its commercial agents, which interfered with the order's caravans plying back and forth across Poland. Jadwiga's world-heralded, moving effort had its intimate personal angle. Whenever the order troubled him, Jagiello could not control his bitter impatience with his wife and her group of pacifist seigneurs, which helped to widen the breach made by their differences regarding crown lands and support of Vytautas. There were rumors that sharp words and neglect caused the Queen much unhappiness, but we hear no words of her own confirming such reports. There was loneliness, that all knew, but if the King made her suffer, she concealed that fact beneath a control and dignity which had never yet deserted her. To chroniclers who saw her work in perspective, she appeared more and more exalted, her self-immolation increasingly sublime. "White dove of the ark," one wrote, who held the trembling olive branch above the mounting tides of passion and hate. In 98, Prince Vytautas, fighting some 200 miles beyond Vilnius, won another great Tatar victory. This made it still more difficult for the Queen to stand firmly against support of the Eastern Wars, in which she still foresaw inevitable ultimate defeat. How much already had Vytautas' wars cost Poland? She had withheld grants when she could, and prevented many Poles from going off with him to the steppes. It was with a feeling of sadness and impotence that she saw Vytautas, now strong and independent in Lithuania, receive from Jagiello part of Podolia, which had come to the Polish crown under Casimir. Then she took a bold but considered step. She wrote Vytautas, whose goal was independent control of Lithuania, asking him to pay, on crown lands in his possession, the taxes of a loyal vassal. Some gasped. Many did not conceal their misgivings as to the consequences of this demand. Might not Vytautas turn once again to the order? Others believed him too deeply engaged in Russia to treat the matter as seriously as he might have at another time. In the Senate, which he convened, after reading the Queen's letter, he asked if anyone had ever heard that Lithuania or Samogitia had paid tribute to Poland. No, came the expected cry. Thus supported at home, and by the order abroad, he again gave his attention to Tatar war plans. Sigismund's visit at the end of the year offered pleasant relief from controversy. Both sovereigns were eager to make his reception outstrip, if possible, preceding ones, and it seemed to. During their reign, Wawel Courtyard had not witnessed a more striking series of tourneys. They attracted knights and ladies from far and near. On the first day, 20 knights in green and in steel armor were conducted to the lists by 20 ladies in green and silver robes, each superbly mounted and leading her knight by ribbons of her chosen colors. At supper, the fortunate lady awarded the prize to the victor. After several days of jousts and balls, Sigismund returned well satisfied to Hungary, carrying with him many gifts. Then, as the last year of the century approached, suddenly for Jadwiga, the whole world was changed.